Our last speaker is going to be absolutely fascinating, talking about cloud security from a responsibility perspective. AJ Yawn is joining us here today, and he brings with him a tremendous experience in compliance in a lot of cloud arenas, lots of cloud experience and certifications, which if you've worked in the AWS environment, it seems like, you know, the only thing that I get more than subscribe and save is ads for more AWS services that do amazing and wonderful things. So my hat is off to you on keeping up with all those, let alone staying certified with them. What I think is cool about his background as well is AJ brings with us a background at both the national consulting level as well as from his own firm, and his kind of self-started work that he's doing with ByteChek, and doing some amazing work there. So we're glad to have you here to round out our day here, and I'm looking forward to your commentary here on cloud security, specifically with a responsibility angle. So I will turn it over to you to lead us out, sir.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Appreciate it. Allison, can you give me control again? I think I somehow lost it, but I think I'm good to go now. There we go. All right. As Phil mentioned, I'll be discussing the shared responsibility model today. Really excited for this. I'm excited to close it out. I know everyone's been sticking it through and participating and learning a ton. I just learned a lot about PowerShell from Mick, and looking forward to talking about the shared responsibility model. So a little bit about me, like Phil mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO at ByteChek. It's a cybersecurity SaaS company focused on automating cybersecurity compliance assessments. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for a little over a decade, spent about half of that time in the US Army for about 6 years, both here in the States and overseas deployed, where I earned the rank of captain. Got out and went to go work in a consulting space. And I've earned a few AWS certs, sit on a few professional association boards, including the National Association of Black Compliance and Risk Management Professionals, proud graduate of Florida State University, where I played a little basketball, and graduate of Georgetown University. But enough about me. Let's get into the actual conversation. So what is the shared responsibility model? To me, it's the most important foundational concept to think about when you're thinking about, to understand when you're thinking about cloud security. And I think you all agree when we break this down. And on the screen here, this is the perfect definition of the shared responsibility model. It outlines really the key points. Let's unpack it a little bit, right? The shared responsibility model outlines the security obligations of that cloud service provider. We're talking Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud Platform, as well as the security obligations of the users or the companies using the cloud. Somebody like myself, we're hosted on the cloud at ByteChek, or the organizations that you all are a part of. I always tell individuals that are looking to get into cybersecurity or looking to get into the field to learn cloud. Because if you're a user in this interconnected environment, the chances of the organization that you're a part of, or the organization that you're going to be a part of, chances of them being hosted in the cloud or working tangibly with the cloud are very high. So users or companies using the cloud, all of us are impacted by cloud. But the key word here in this definition, in my opinion, is accountability. Now, the definition of accountability is when an individual or a department experiences consequences for their performance or actions. And accountability, it's essential for organizations, it's essential for society in general, which we've seen some recent news that came out yesterday. And without it, it's very difficult to get people to assume ownership of their own actions because they believe they won't face any consequences. And this is so important, and why it matters so much for cloud security perspective, because with the shared responsibility model, accountability is assigned and clearly outlined. You know who's going to be responsible for these things based off of their actions or sometimes inactions in the cloud. Something common that I hear that really outlines why this is such a misunderstood concept. I talk to a lot of customers, I talk to a lot of individuals, and they're like, hey, I'm hosted on AWS, AJ, so that means I'm secure, right? Or another one, when a company is asked to prove their compliance, they mention, oh, I don't need to get a SOC 2 report, or I don't need a HIPAA report because Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, where I'm hosted, they have the SOC 2. That's false. This is where the accountability and the definition is key. there is a responsibility there of certain controls, certain things in place that are the responsibility of Amazon, and that's covered in their SOC 2 or their compliance reports. And then there's other things that are responsibility of you as the cloud customer that are your responsibility. And it's so important to understand because it ensures both the cloud provider and the users understand that they have responsibilities to perform certain security controls. And when those controls are not put in place, it's not anyone else's fault but their own. And it's really critical to understand this point when you're thinking about cloud security, thinking about moving into the cloud, or just securing a cloud environment. Because in order to protect that cloud environment, right, in order to actually secure your resources, there can't be any misconceptions about who is supposed to secure what. And when those misconceptions happen, that's when breaches, that's when bad things happen. Now we're going to get into the details of what this means at a somewhat deeper level. I only have 20 minutes or so here with you all, but we're going to get into it a little bit deeper. But before we go into that, I personally believe the cloud service providers should do a much better job of preventing security breaches from happening. There's enough information out there about what are the common breaches, what are the things that organizations are doing that are on their side of the shared responsibility model. There's enough information out there for us to know, the cloud providers to know, what are the common things that the users keep doing. And I think this whole concept with shared responsibility and cloud providers having more of a responsibility to prevent things goes back to something you hear a lot about in cybersecurity. It's stuff we heard today, not necessarily the bad part of this, but we heard a lot about humans in Ron Eddings' talk around security architecture. We heard about layer 8. Jen also talked about it in her talk as well about layer 8, the human layer, right? And we always hear humans are the weakest link. And I personally don't like that statement. I think it's just a poor excuse for poor engineering or lack of security guardrails. Because last I checked, humans are flawed. I make mistakes often. I hope everybody that's listening, you all acknowledge that you make some mistakes often, right? And I think we're going to continue to make mistakes. So just blaming and putting our hands up and saying, well, humans are the weakest links, that's why bad stuff happens. That's not acceptable, especially at a cloud provider level. They should do more to prevent bad things from happening. So instead of blaming humans or saying humans are the weakest link, or that's on the customer side of the shared responsibility model, I think cloud providers should do a much better job of preventing users from making those mistakes, especially making mistakes, obviously that are on the customer side of their shared responsibility model. In the past on AWS, when you would launch a new S3 bucket, which is S3 stands for simple storage service. It's an object storage service on S3 where you can upload things like Word documents, PDFs, videos, etc. When you launched a new bucket, it was by default public. It had a limited access for anybody that has an AWS account was able to access that S3 bucket. And that was the default setting. Now AWS has changed that and they've updated this to the point where now you have to go through some hoops to make a bucket public. But if you think about that if you look in the news and just do a Google search of S3 public buckets, you'll spend all night down a rabbit hole looking at all of the breaches. But if you think about the fact that that was the default setting, yes, it's on the side of the customer to configure that right, but should it be that easy? And I think, all the cloud providers, AWS and Azure and GCP, they've made a ton of strides to prevent these issues and to make them a little bit harder for people to do bad things. But there's still some things that I can think of off the top of my head that should not be default settings. Things that, are a little bit beyond the scope of today's talk. But the point remains that while there's a shared responsibility model, I'm going to get into what's the responsibility of the cloud provider versus the customer. I still think it's very important that cloud providers and customers of the cloud providers continue to hold them accountable to help prevent these things, enforce things, create new ways to stop bad things from happening because they can. So beyond my little rant there, let's get into and talk about the difference between who's supposed to secure what. So if you don't take anything away from today's talk, especially away from that little rant about the cloud providers doing a better job, take away this. The cloud service provider, your AWSs, your Azures, your Google Clouds of this world, they're responsible for security of the cloud. And while the customer, you and I, our companies that we're hosted on, we're responsible for security in the cloud. And when I say security of the cloud, that's including the physical infrastructure, the network, the virtualization layer, and the host operating system. And what does this mean? You know, the cloud providers, they're running the physical data centers. Think big buildings with racks and racks of servers, things that used to have to be managed by the companies themselves. They used to have to manage this. And this is all managed and run by the cloud providers to the point where you can't even visit those physical locations. Now, if you're in those locations, you probably have seen some really large unmarked buildings where these cloud providers are hosting these data centers, but you're not even allowed to visit it. You can't go audit it as a customer, which means the security of that is on the AWS. And when I say security of these facilities, what does that mean? That means CCTV cameras, man traps, security guards that you have to hire, you have to pay them, you have to organize all of that. Parking, any kind of physical infrastructure. And anybody that's been in security a while, that's listening to this or is transferring over from other fields, you probably have done physical security checks. I remember walking through data centers doing physical security checks where you have to check for raised floors. You check for environmental controls with the AC. You check for unlimited power supplies. You check for generators as well. You check for all of these different things that no longer are, that auditors have to check for anymore, no longer are the responsibility of the company, because the cloud provider is the one that's responsible for securing that physical infrastructure. It's on them. And you know, that makes things a lot easier for companies. You no longer have to worry about the physical toll it takes to run that, the physical cost, the operational cost and the overhead to run your physical infrastructure, and you can focus on your application. And when we go back to that word accountability, if there's physical issues, say a hard drive goes bad, say the AC goes out in the building, then that causes some issues. It's on the cloud provider to fix that. And if they can't fix them, the outage, the downtime, the bad things that happen because of that is the result and the fault of the providers. This isn't the fault of us if AWS or Microsoft's building loses power. That's not on us because it's not our responsibility, because they're responsible for the security of the cloud. And obviously, you know, Phil mentioned that I come from a risk and compliance background. So let's think about this from a compliance perspective. And I'll use SOC 2 as an example, but this really applies across all the different compliance frameworks. Instead of an auditor showing up to your office and saying, I need to check your physical doors, I need to go in and check your server rooms and making sure you have different physical security settings there, they rely on the cloud provider SOC 2 report. You know, AWS, GCP, Azure all have their own SOC 2, HIPAA, et cetera, reports. So the auditors now go to that report and say, okay, I can see that physical security was tested there, and I no longer have to test it in your own assessment, which is great for you as a person that's hosting your application. But again, that's the responsibility of the cloud provider. That's on their side of the shared responsibility model. So I mentioned earlier, people always ask me, hey, I'm hosting on AWS, right? So I don't need to get a SOC 2. I can use their SOC 2. That's only partially true. You still need to get your own SOC 2, but at least the sections of your SOC 2 report or other compliance report, are the sections around physical and environmental controls. Those will be inherited and passed down. But everything else, that's where we get into the customer responsibility. That's where that comes into play. You notice I didn't say anything about users. I didn't say anything about protecting your boundary or data encryption or patching. That I didn't mention any of that because those are different sides of the shared responsibility model. And that's where some of the issues come into play with this understanding, because there is a stopping point for the cloud providers. They're only going to do up to a certain point, and then from there, their hands are off. And when we talk about customers and we talk about the organizations or the users of the cloud, they're responsible for, again, security in the cloud. And it covers these things that we see on the screen here, such as network security, identity management, data encryption at rest, the guest operating system, and a number of other things. And we'll make this a little bit more tangible here. Sorry, we'll go back one slide. And I think personally, when we're thinking about customers that are using the cloud and customers that are responsible for certain aspects, if you ask me, identity and access management is the most important cybersecurity concept or principle here, because you can have all of the fancy security controls in place. You can buy all the tools. You have the biggest budget out there. You say you're able to hire this entire team of presenters today, right? All of these great people that showed up today are the members of your security team. You have a all-star team in place with all of the greatest tools out there that were ever created. However, every single one of your users is using the same password. Nobody has multi-factor authentication. and you're storing the password publicly on your LinkedIn. It doesn't matter what security controls you have in place if your front door is wide open and people can walk right through it. So identity and access management is so important. And guess what? It's the responsibility of the customer. The cloud provider is not going to play a role in this. When you create a new AWS account, and it's very similar on Azure and GCP, just a little bit of different terminology, you get what's called a root account, an account that allows you to basically do everything, including create new users. And you should throw that root account away and not use it. And that's obviously for another conversation, but you're responsible for managing that. The cloud providers aren't going to say, hey, you need to put multi-factor authentication on every single user. They're not going to say you need to enforce certain password complexities. They're not going to get involved at all in identity and access management. It's the responsibility of the customer. Similar information and data. What about all of that? What about if you have a bunch of customers that have sensitive information such as PII or personally identifiable information? What if that's hosted in the cloud? Protecting that is the responsibility of you as the organization. Thinking back to accountability, it's the responsibility of the consumer or the customer to protect that data. And if that data is breached, it's the cloud customer who should own those actions that cause those breaches. Maybe you're not protecting it, you're not encrypting it at rest. Maybe you're not protecting your boundary and not having your security groups or other policies in place to protect people from being able to access things that maybe they shouldn't be accessing, right? All of these things are the responsibility of the customer. And the thing that you to think about, because I think this often happens when individuals are thinking about getting into the cloud or understanding cloud security, we put a little bit too much on this is the cloud. Oh, this is so different. And while the terminology is different, while some of the threats are definitely different, at its core, it's still security. It's still cybersecurity. So the things we're talking about around identity and access management, managing vulnerabilities for your guest operating system, managing your boundary with security groups or virtual firewalls, encrypting your data, protecting your data at rest or data in transit. These are all cybersecurity concepts we've learned to love and know, and they still apply in the cloud. The biggest thing to understand is, guess what? They still apply in the cloud. You don't get to not do those things because you moved your information to the cloud. It still has to be done, and that's on your side as the customer of the shared responsibility model. And there are some shared aspects of the shared responsibility model. An example is patch management. Because if we think about the cloud, I described it to you, right? We have physical data centers where Amazon or Microsoft are managing these physical facilities. So when you ever hear somebody and they ask you what the cloud is, just tell them it's someone else's computer. It's just Amazon or Microsoft or Google's computer sitting in a data center. It's a little bit more complex than that, but at its core, that's all it is. But that physical server, that host operating system, AWS or Microsoft or Google, they have to patch that. But guess what? The guest operating system that you're running on top of that, whether you're running a Linux operating system, a Windows operating system on top of that, you have to patch that. That's on you as the customer. So that's a shared responsibility. And that's really important to understand too. And today I didn't have enough time to dive into the different cloud computing models, such as infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service versus software as a service. But those are really important to understand when we're thinking about the shared responsibility model as well, because the responsibility shifts depending on the cloud computing model that you choose. If you're choosing traditional infrastructure as a service, a lot of the things that I'm talking about today around the physical security of the facilities, the environmental controls, those ACs, those backup power supplies, making sure that there is, things are being maintained in the right way. That stuff applies at the infrastructure as service cloud computing model. But when you start to move a little bit into a higher level, such as platform as a service, some of those responsibilities as a customer shift to the cloud provider. Maybe you're using a platform as a service model where you no longer manage the guest operating system. That PaaS provider is the one that manages that and keeps that up to date. So it's very important when you're thinking about the shared responsibility model to understand at its core, what is the cloud computing model that you're using, and then start to draw out this line. Where are our responsibilities as an organization, and what are we relying on AWS or Microsoft or these other providers for? So why does this matter? As we're talking about the shared responsibility model, it comes down to the threats that are out there and the things that continue to happen that really are preventable. most of the breaches, when you unpack cloud breaches, it comes down to a very simple misconfiguration. And I think that misconfiguration is, again, because of a lack of understanding of the shared responsibility model. The coolest thing about the cloud is how fast and easy it is to spin up new resources, which also presents problems. Because you spin up a new resource so fast, you forget to do some of the basics. You forget some of the key things that you should be doing to protect your environment. And as we spoke about earlier, right, protecting your boundary, protecting your customers' data, that's the responsibility of the customer. So these S3 bucket breaches or Azure blob breaches that we see here on the screen, these are all preventable, because if you understand at its core, I am the one that is in control of my data, my customers' data. I'm the one that's responsible for the boundary around my cloud environment to protect that. You're not going to leave this stuff wide open. You're going to understand, and you're going to look at it at a deeper level to make sure that you are doing your part, that you're handling your side of that responsibility. But as I spoke about again before, I think the cloud providers can do a lot more to prevent these things from happening. There's things with S3 bucket breaches that AWS is doing to make it a little bit harder, but there's also ways to automate the remediation of any misconfigurations in the cloud. Another very cool thing from a cloud security perspective is a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about that are the responsibility of the customer can all be automated. Doesn't require a full team of people, doesn't require you to be a huge cloud expert. It's just a simple setup of you being able to say, I don't want any of my buckets to be public. So every time someone makes a bucket, make sure it's public, or make sure the data is encrypted at rest. It's really easy to do the right thing on the cloud, and it's also really easy to do the wrong thing. And it all comes back to understanding whose responsibility is it? Who's accountable for this if it goes bad? And understanding that is just a critical aspect for cloud security, and something that I think as anybody that's getting into the cloud, especially if you're going after any cloud certifications, such as AWS Cloud Practitioner or Azure Fundamentals, or even any of the cloud agnostic certs, you're gonna have to learn the shared responsibility model. And here's a few links to some additional resources here on this slide. AWS does a great job of explaining the shared responsibility model. The Cloud Security Alliance, they have a vendor agnostic blog post about the shared responsibility model, and Microsoft Azure as well has a really good blog about it. And the concepts are the same across the cloud providers. It's really the same. Security of the cloud is for the cloud provider, and security in the cloud is for the customer. And lastly, I would say to truly understand the shared responsibility model, go get your hands dirty. The cool thing about the cloud is that you can get a free account, spin up some resources, break things, and really get your hands dirty and learn what it means, all these concepts that you're hearing. And you'll very quickly, if you just go to the cloud and spin up a new EC2 instance on AWS or a new virtual machine on Azure, you'll be able to very quickly understand, whoa, I'm responsible for a lot here. It's similar to just running your own server at your house or at your organization. You're responsible for a lot of the decisions there, and it becomes very tangible when you get your hands dirty. So definitely encourage you all to do that. Dive into those resources. I'm happy to answer some more questions. I think this summit is amazing. I'm really grateful for all the speakers that came before me today and provided some great information. And especially because it's free for anybody that's trying to get into cybersecurity. Like Mick said, this field is amazing. I hope that everybody that's here is fired up and ready to join us in this great field. We need more people in the field. Specifically, we need more women, and we need more minorities in this field as well to fill that talent shortage that's out there. We can't do it by hiring the same people. We have to hire people that are different than us and diverse. And I'm excited about the future of cybersecurity. I should have attended a New to Cyber Summit like this just 4 years ago when I was getting out of the military. And 4 years later, I'm here speaking, which is just a testament to how fast things can happen in this field when you put enough time in. So I'm really grateful for everyone at SANS for the opportunity, really grateful for everyone that listened in and stuck with it here through the end, as I know it could be a long day, but it's so much great information from all the different speakers, and hope you all learned something from this talk.
Thank you so much, AJ. And a couple of things that were in your hallway channel as well. Where to go? Ross mentioned summit we got coming up. It's going to kind of go a lot more in depth about what you talked about. It's going to be our Cloud Security Next, CloudSec Next, which is coming up. And really, I mean, obviously cloud in general is not going away. A couple of questions came in. I'm going to reframe one of those. So I think the way that it was originally asked might be a little bit too niche, and I want to try to broaden it out a little bit. I'm wondering if you have a non opinion on which of your cloud providers out there you feel provide the best opportunity for security controls. So I'm reframing it because I don't want to ask which one has the best security, because as you said, it's a lot of how you employ the controls they provide. Which ones do you think give the right balance of knobs and dials that would give their customers the ability to most comprehensively lock down the environment?
Yeah, so I would have answered that question differently about 6 months ago. But I started diving into
Okay.
Azure a little bit more, and I have been extremely impressed with Azure. And and the reason is because you can do far more with Azure from a security perspective with less. On AWS, you have to put a lot of different pieces together. You have to jerry rig a few
Okay.
together and get a lot of notifications in there. But Azure, you can do a lot with less. So I would say right now, I would go with Microsoft Azure. And I know all of my AWS enthusiasts that have known me as the AWS guy are probably ripping their ears out, but Azure has made some great strides. Azure Sentinel, Azure Security Center are really awesome. And I would say that's a great, really, they have made a ton of strides on automating some of the stuff that could be potential breaches.
Oh, that's fascinating to hear. And I'm especially fascinated by the way you set that up with, 6 months ago, you might have had a different opinion because, I mean, this stuff changes what feels like on a daily basis sometimes. So it's kind of cool to see how competition is evolving to give these different controls in the different environments. That's awesome. Thank you for that perspective for sure. There's a couple of other questions that were peppered throughout in here. Some other fans of Azure as well, which is kind of cool given your context that you had. But I'll kind of let you get a little bit into those to see which of those you think are most interesting to explore a little bit further. But thank you very much, AJ. Appreciate you sharing your experience and your perspective with us. And I agree, we've got a lot of folks who are entering this field that we need to have ready to step into these roles. And it's pretty cool. Like you said, you got out of the Army 4 years ago. I've got a few more than 4 years since I got out of the Air Force, but it's cool to see these generations kind of progress down. So we got the next generation coming up now. We get to help with them too, which is fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. This has been an amazing event. Thank you, Phil.